Hello, this is Off to Battle with Jeremiah Bork. I'm doing the custom battle format so that we see a little bit of what I'm talking about as I have a little discussion about taking your Cult of Sotek campaign and going from the bottom of the barrel to the top of the pile. Because all the difficulty is that you cannot use a simple unit of Saurus spears without paying 3 times what you're supposed to until you rule 2 provinces, which is pretty trivial if you're not really messing up your Vortex campaign, and a big problem if you're in campaign. So this is your starting army. You'll notice immediately that your Skink Chief, who's very good because, well, you put him in your army in order to get better replenishment after battle. His actual battle value is really, really low at this stage. So he has his uses, but he's very difficult to get much out of. So the battle value is actually appropriate. He can fire all day, but his missiles do not do much damage. He can fire and inflict poison, which is nice, but that's not an issue with this army. Lots of units will have some poison. And Tehenhauin, he does it in an aura because of the legendary weapon that it comes out. Start right out of the bat with. Your Arc of Bastiladon is your best unit in terms of supporting your army, but mainly because it's a huge pain to replace if you lose it in the early game. And the same goes for the Salamander Hunting Pack because you can no longer get them like when you started out on launch. Well, on launch with Tehenhauin, I should say. You could use these as part of the Skink chain of buildings, but now you can't. It's the Blood Shrines. So those are the units that are difficult to replace, and they certainly are an asset, but you can live without them if you just lose all this and start over with your lord, because stuff can happen. You'd want to avoid that, but it happens. Skink Skirmishers, the problem for them is very simple. They are great at supporting a Saurus army early on, but we don't have one. So their existence is basically a lesser version of the Chameleon Skinks. Of course, they are lower cost, but basically the only reason to have them over other units is because they can fire all day. But unless they manage to fire all day and survive, and stay in the fight, and are at a range to actually inflict damage, they're not going to get the value you would prefer out of them. This is completely different for the Skink cohort with Javelins. And, put very simply, it is absolutely viable, and yes, a lot of people seem to do this. I hate doing it, but you can just, add a whole bunch of these. And the reason is that once you get the basic tech in the Skink tech tree, this ammunition will go up to 4. And all that is front-loaded. In other words, it doesn't take very long to fire all those javelins, and then they're doing all that damage, and it's done. And anything else you do with them after that is bonus and gravy, and that's great. They can form a rather large line. It's hard to get things past them if they're doing that. You can go through them, but then you have to eat the javelins. And some things are much better at eating the javelins than others. So, yes, this is an option. And we are not going to think too hard about that. Now, I would say that the key controversy is really about the red-crested skinks. And that's because that on Legendary they are complete garbage, which is not a shock. They are melee infantry. They are melee infantry with a base melee attack that is not that high. They do poison, they do armor piercing, they have a charge bonus that, without any modification at all, is actually pretty good. They're a frenzy unit that's not unbreakable. Their leadership needs to be buffed by heroes and lords. They do have poison. So, in a sense, with this 30 base armor, they're a melee tar pit unit. In other words, if they're fighting an opponent with lots of melee but little for ranged, I mean if they're fighting like vampire counts, which Tehenhauin wouldn't be. But if they are, these guys are going to do damage. They are going to probably lose a lot of models against a lot of stuff, but they're going to hit fairly hard when they do hit, and they have Frenzy. So if their leadership is not lower than 50% of what they started with, they have plus 10 melee attack across the board and some damage buffs. But mainly, plus 10 melee attack, and they're not going to be affected by fear or terror. They are going to be affected by being surrounded and things like that, and being cut to pieces by high alpha armies. So that's one of your major options. Now all these guys have a speed like 46, 46, Bastillodon is 4T, 46, 46, 70, but how much do you want to use these guys on their own? Basically, unless you have, I mean, they don't fire behind them when they're retreating, so you have to micro them very hard or put them in a relatively safe place. And then they do their job. They are very good at damaging lightly armored targets. They have an explosive effect to some degree. They have a large bonus versus large units, so they are basically there to chew up cavalry. But despite the large bonus, I mean the bonus versus large, that is itself large, they don't prosper fighting heavily armored stuff. But on the other hand, they can still do very decent damage against lightly armored infantry. So, with that in mind, the red-crested skink, and eventually you can buff them quite a bit with Tehenhauin. But basically, I want to take a look at the very, very basic skink cohort. Now, I would say not for multiplayer. And lots of people will say, but Jeremiah, they are worse in every way than the skink cohort with javelins. Well, they're the same, except that the javelins and the extra gold cost. In campaign, you can get away with having several of these units and just filling spaces and not being red-crested skinks, because you don't need red-crested if it's not an armored target. They cost 75 gold to the 100 gold for your ones with javelins. In both cases, they don't require buildings. So why on earth would you do this? Well, you're basically using them like goblins. You're treating them as expendable. You're using them because you're saving gold that you want to commit to something else. Building your empire, building your buildings, getting other units that are more expensive elsewhere in your army. So that's basically the motivation. And then you can have, you know, a couple of these. To get a quest, you have to get 4 in the army, but you don't really need 4 in order to have an option against higher tier troops. And then you're basically countering what the other side's doing. But if they actually do catch up with archer units or, you know, higher tier infantry that's being whittled down by something else, that's when you want red-crested skinks. So, even though that Tehenhauin he precedes having chameleon skinks in Total War Warhammer 2. So he's not boosting these guys much. But they can still be boosted by the right of Sotek. And just in general, these are tar pits of a different sort. They have half-decent armor here. Their defense is way higher than the offense. If you have any skills invested in the skirmisher line at all, which is something I'd recommend in a lot of cases, then they're going to be lasting a fair bit. And that's with the dodge that helps. However, of course, they just don't have that many models in them compared to red-crested skinks. because all these are being measured by Ultra Icy. So there's just less of them. I mean, there's 160 on Ultra for the skin cohort. So you can't depend much on their weapons, on their ranged weapons, but they will explode, they'll get through shields, they will whittle down and do damage. But where you really enjoy having these sometimes is because you can get them hitting artillery in the back. They can use another unit for that, but they're not bad at that. They have a place, but generally they're there in order to slow the enemy down and give yourself time to use other units that you want to keep more. So here's where we get to chameleon skins. And let's say that we have 4 of these instead of skin cohorts with javelins. Now these are tar pits dedicated to pinning missile units in place. They are just really, really, really hard to get rid of because of the missile resistance. So it's just a lot of effort for the enemy to get rid of them. And if you dislodge them, then if they're skirmishing or whatever, I mean, they have, 48 speed. They're using poison with every one of their missile attacks, so everything chasing them is 15% slower. They're certainly not immune to damage to getting whittled down, but it's just a lot of effort for the other side. And of course, they have stock. And that means you can get them in the back, you can hit artillery with them. Of course, there's a lot of enemies that will make that difficult for you. But the point is that you can. So, what's another... early on, you can get... All you need is a tier 2 building, and you can build Pterodon Riders with Fire Leech Bolas. And certainly they cost more, but if I'm using skin cohorts to pad my front line, I can actually do it. So all you need is the building, and then you build these guys, and it helps a lot with specific situations. Unless an enemy is just beefed up enough with missiles that they can actually have the missile units to shoot you down and focus on you, which is the key. They have to also focus on it and not be shooting other things. You can probably do a lot of damage. You can use the Fire Leech Bolas to whittle down melee troops. They're like a lesser version of the hunting pack for that purpose. And they can fire while moving, so that's all great. And I'd say that's your basic stuff. But before moving on to something else, I really, really want to mention. Oh, they're hiding. So, Temple Guard are not something that you're going to see for Tehenhauin at this stage of the campaign. They're just not. Kroxagors. Here's another unit that I'm sure is hot garbage on Legendary, but that's not the point here. They come with a lot fewer units because they're monstrous. They have armor. They have very, very decent leadership. Their speed is not inferior to anything else in the skink line. Their melee attack and melee defense is, cavalry grade, but they don't behave like cavalry. They're going in there and they're using armor-piercing damage with a big fat bonus to infantry. And they're whirling dervishes, essentially, and doing small AoE effects, and they are mulchers of infantry. And they also have primal instincts, but you want them to have hit points greater than 20%, okay? They also cause fear, which is very good. They can even act as a siege attacker and let you immediately attack walled cities. Basically, they're just tough, and they're a loose formation sort of unit. What you can do, instead of sending them off on mad flanks, because then anything is going to shoot at them, cavalry is going to go after them, you can send them through your thin front line of skink cohorts. or just use them as reserves all over the place. And then what they'll do is they'll mix with the skinks. They'll provide, if not accuracy, then they'll provide the power. And even though if they're hitting regular targets and you're not doing the armor piercing efficiently against them, well, they're still going to have that massive bonus versus infantry. So basically, what you have if you build up the skirmisher building and get to them is you have a back line. They're like linebackers in a football formation, an American football formation. Except that I say a front line because normally I say linebackers, but in football, your biggest dudes are generally your front line. But that's a different thing. Here, they're reinforcements. They're second-line units that go to the front line, and they're protected in that way from some of the arrows coming in because they're going to be hitting all sorts of lesser units with a lot of numbers. And they have shields to help minimize that damage. So basically, unless you're fighting dark shards, lots of armor piercing coming in, hailing from the skies, which you might be. But failing a situation like that, they are going to be stubborn units for the enemy to fight. And what you do is you combine them with the skinks. I mean, let's say that you don't have the chameleon skinks on skirmish, and they're just hanging around the front. Then what happens... I'll just get rid of one of these. Then what happens is that it's providing a buffer, basically. You're adding tensile strength to the mix. So that's basically where you are for the really early armies. And other things that you can do, of course, is adding some more beasts. And what are some of your options? If you have the building, you can go with Feral Bastillodon pretty much right away. It's dirt cheap, and it's very, very hard to bring down, and it causes terror. It's not great in terms of the stats, in terms of the mobility, in terms of a lot of things. It basically just doesn't inflict nearly as much damage as its ability to soak up damage. But it's great for blowing up bloated corpses. And it does have a pretty decent bonus versus infantry. And all that armor-piercing damage means that when it does hit someone like an enemy lord, an enemy hero, it's going to do significant damage even if they're armored. And something else that certainly you can do early on is a Bastillodon with a solar engine on it. And these aren't prone to rampage, but the beam is not very accurate. But it also... it blinds enemies, but basically what you see here is that it's got a lot of base damage, and it's got a lot of explosive damage, and the armor-piercing factor means that it's doing enough that even if you're hitting depth guard or something like that, it will take a nice big chunk out of a unit of infantry. Very long reload time. The biggest weakness of this is that you need line of sight. And keeping line of sight going basically means revolving your entire army around that. And I don't think you want to do that as an early Tehenhauin army. I think that what you want to do is keep your options open so that you can go on the offensive. So that's the main thing, and this has been just a little discussion of early to mid-game units, because half your battle is against the amount of income that you're bringing in. So half the battle is making sure that you're not spinning yourself into a gutter and actually managing to stick around. Then once you get to hit one on bear mounts, get him more spells, then you're starting to be able to really get this engine moving. And that's going to be all for now.